the tip of the iceberg as well is connection. But beyond that, there's an actual path to self-liberation. There is a path to freedom. There is a path to love. There is a path to compassion and to healing and to forgiveness. And it lays beyond our limited view of what we think this practice can really give us.
Manoj, thank you so much for coming on to At the End of the Tunnel. It is an honor. And I say this every time, it's an honor to interview you. But what I really mean by that is in preparation for these conversations, I will do some research. And even though you and I have a relationship, a friendship outside of, this podcast, I don't get to know someone's story as much as I do when I do my little, research before an interview. So now I'm truly honored to talk to you about some of your experiences, because there's a lot I didn't even know. And I'm curious to kind of fill in some of those gaps. So thank you very much for agreeing to come on to the show.
Oh, anytime that you and I get to spend together is always a lot of fun. And it's an honor to be on this podcast. I know you have some world-renowned meditation teachers and wonderful humans on here. So I feel very excited to be a part of that. Thank you.
So anyone listening to this, they may hear your voice and your accent, and they may think, okay, this is some white guy from, Australia. But looking at you, anyone looking at you, especially in the West or in America specifically, would automatically, without hearing you speak, would automatically assume you are Black, probably from the hood somewhere, So you're actually from Sri Lanka. You're Sri Lankan. Are you full Sri Lankan or are you part Sri Lankan?
Yeah. So it's, I don't know if I had this conversation with you, when we caught up in Mexico City, but the truth is my actual ethnicity, I'm in the process of finding out. I just got a 23andMe very recently after I found out a bit of a family secret, dating back to my grandparents, in which, I don't really know my biological grandfather. And so I could go into a lot more detail in that at some point, but I have grown up believing that I am, yes, born in Sri Lanka, raised in Australia, but there is a very good chance that I have a mixture of Portuguese and Ethiopian blood. So I'm waiting to find out, and I can come back for the big reveal if it ends up being something exciting.
So talk about your name. Is that a typical Sri Lankan name, Manoj?
Yeah, it's actually pronounced Manoj, and it was given to me by my auntie, who was in love with an Indian movie star. I don't know what his surname is, but his name was Manoj. And so my auntie lays claim to giving me the name. And it's not an overtly popular name in Sri Lanka, but, doing some research in my early 20s, I found out that it means Prince of Hearts. So I'll take that.
I'm imagining in that Sri Lankan culture also, people tend to get married young and have children young. And you end up having a child at, was it 19? Obviously 18, not on purpose. You were 18, yeah. So talk about that experience and how that changed your life at that age.
Yeah. I was in a relationship for 7 years with my daughter's mother. And obviously at the age of 18, none of us planned to have a child. She was my first love. And when it happened, it didn't even occur to me that I had options, if I'm being really vulnerable and open right now. It just occurred to me that, okay, this is what we're doing. Like, how can I be a good father? And I wanted to be a good father and provide the way that my dad had, and I mentioned earlier on, like, family was so important to our dynamic as a culture and as an identity for me and my family. And so I wanted to instill that. I wanted to be a good father. And, I tried everything to do that. And I feel really proud of who I was back then. You know, a lot of messing up, but I had the foresight, and I had some really good role models around me that showed me what a father could be like. And so I took responsibility, and you know, we stayed together for many years, and we raised a really beautiful young woman now. But it was very hard. It was very hard. Like my friends were in college, they were partying, going out, taking drugs, nightclubs, and you know, I would be home changing nappies on Saturday nights, and it never felt like I was missing out. It never felt like I was missing out. But when we eventually separated, when I was around 23, 24, I realized how much I had missed out on in my life, and how I had this yearning to explore and get to know myself. And so I did that.
Well, prior to the news that you were having a child, right? What did you want to be? What did you see yourself becoming? How did you define success in the world at that 18-year-old stage of life?
Well, I knew the definition of success was equated with money and security. That was what was embedded into my psyche. It's like, be a doctor or be a lawyer, or be a businessman or be an engineer. And I remember my first love was to be a dancer. Like, that quickly was not an option for my parents. My second option was to be a fashion designer. I don't know why. I'm like, I want to create beautiful fashion, because I always had a real penchant for clothing. And my mother sat me down and she's like, no, you can't do that, because, you know, how many people make money off that? And again, it was very narrow thinking, but, you know, this is how she was raised as well. So I don't blame her for that. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I just know I had to do whatever I did really, really well. And it was likely going to be in business, because that was the most vague university degree I could get at the time. So I had my sights set on that, you know. And then my final year of high school, obviously I had Taylor. And so I didn't end up going to college until many years later. I started working straight away. I started working at a bank, at a branch, actually. That was my first job. And it was humbling, but the motivation was I was now looking after a child. So be humble and work hard was my motto at that point.
Were you good at it, working at a branch?
Or
is it literally just a means to an end?
No, it was probably both. Like, I never saw myself staying at a branch, working at a bank. But I ended up working at this bank for about 9 years, actually. Like, I was there for a while, and I worked my way up actually to being a marketing director, you know, which was a really pivotal moment in my life as well, knowing I could do that. But I loved people, and I got to meet people a lot. I got to see people. I got to connect with people. I got to listen to people. I got to be human, and I got to see different versions of people. So that part of my job was really fun. I can't say I had a very strategic mind at that age, or I was very analytical, but I definitely enjoyed the other aspects of the role.
Had you reached sort of a ceiling in terms of your growth in that industry? Is that why you went back to school? Because 8 years is some significant experience.
Yeah, I think very early on, I was really interested in marketing, because it became, I looked at the bank, and I was working for Australia's biggest bank at the point. And I'm like, what is the most creative job I could do right now? And it was marketing and advertising, right? Because I do have a mind that's a lot more creative than it is analytical. And I was definitely not going to do financial planning or go into business banking or anything like that. So it sounded cool, was my motivation for going back to college and to doing marketing. And I ended up doing a master's in marketing, and utilized that for a few years, and then gave that up as well.
Curious, what did you learn in the graduate program in marketing that you didn't know after 8-9 years of working in that banking position in marketing?
I just learned, I think in the first semester, that this is not who I wanted to be. This is not what I wanted to do. And I actually felt very depressed during that course, because I'm like, well, what is my life? Like, what am I going to do with my life if this is what I'm somewhat good at? I have a child to look after. I kind of resigned myself to the fact that, okay, well, this is my life. Like, everyone doesn't get to choose. And I mean, thanks to that probe, because I'm reflecting on that now, and that's what was there. I was like, okay, this is it. I guess I'll just see my days out working for the man. And I think it's similar to what a lot of probably our students come to us with these days. It's like they don't realize the world is more expansive than we think it is. And I genuinely thought this would be my life, and that's it. So I learned very early on it wasn't for me, but I stuck with it because I didn't think I had options.
Well, it sounds like it fit into the model of success that you had been indoctrinated into. But at the same time, with the child and all that, your Buddhist practices fell by the wayside. And you mentioned that you had begun burning the candle at both ends. So talk about that moment of realization that this is not sustainable.
Yeah. That was when I was I completed my course, and I was a marketing director at the time for an insurance company, and I had just begun a long distance relationship. I was managing 5 staff. It was at that point the most lucrative job that I was in. My dad would tell me constantly how proud he was of how I turned my life around at that point. And burning the candle at both ends really meant I was working really, really hard, working out really, really hard, because I was obsessed with how I looked back then. And, me and all my friends would go to the gym after work, and became a thing. And then because I was in the marketing and kind of finance world, on Friday and Saturday nights, we would go and like smash ourselves. Like, literally, we would just drink, and it was pretty gnarly how we would just do that week in and week out, and that became our version of release or fun. And it was pretty constant. And I saw, I was the youngest, obviously, at this point. All the guys and ladies in my team were much older than me, and they were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they were doing this too. And I'm like, okay, so this is my life. Again, I would say that I'm in a job that I'm in a career that I'm not 100% passionate about, and on the weekends I go and drink, and we have laughs and feel bad, and then I back it up the next week, and this is it. I'm like, okay, and I didn't have, again, another version of that, another version of what could be possible to see. So life was very one-dimensional at that point, and eventually I had a pretty serious panic attack at work. And leading up until that, I didn't think that I had anxiety. I didn't think I had any sort of, I knew I was stressed, and I knew I was very internally conflicted about what I had chosen to do with my life. But I didn't think I had any sort of mental health issue. And back then, in those years, we never spoke about mental health. If you had anxiety, there was something seriously wrong with you. You had, like, even the mere mention of seeing a therapist, you were like, whoa, did you hear? Why not just seeing it? It was like that, it was wild. But the panic attack happened one day at work, and it was very innocuous at the start. I came in, I had a coffee, and my assistant came in, gave me a bunch of work, and then just was looking at me really weirdly. And she's like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. And then she looked at me, a few more moments, and then left. And as soon as she left, I felt my hands started to tremor. I felt my heart beat really, really quickly, and almost instantaneously thought it was just the coffee. I'm like, well, strong coffee. But then I felt a swelling of emotion coming up, and I felt like I was about to cry in the middle of my office. And that really started it. I remember running out, and I was walking through the CBD of Melbourne, hyperventilating. And at one point I was in this little alleyway, just hunched down on my knees and on my feet, just thinking I was about to die. And I called up my therapist at the time, and I'm like, I think I'm about to die. And she's like, you better come and see me then. And I went and saw her. And, bless her, but she spent maybe 20, 30 minutes with me and said, I think you have ADHD. And that was a diagnosis. And then the prescription was medication. And that started a whole chain of events. I ended up developing an addiction to the ADHD medication. I've ended up developing chronic insomnia as well as a byproduct of that, and then developed an addiction to the medication to help me sleep. That moved into an eating disorder, that moved into a whole host of other, ailments that kind of accompanied me for about 18 months to 2 years.
You saw a couple of other doctors as well to get second and third opinions, and they all diagnosed you with something different, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So, one said I had depression, and I took SSRIs for about 2 weeks and then was just completely out of my body and stopped that. I went to a shamanic healer because I'm like, I can't hurt, I'm trying all these different things. One said I'm just stressed out and just to rest. And I don't say all of this to denigrate the profession at all. I think, I've got a tremendous therapist right now that it's been a lifesaver. But I also think back then we didn't understand a lot like we do now, for sure. And we tend to be oftentimes very quick with numbing and trying to fix the problem instead of trying to really understand the problem.
So were you sneaking around going to see these healers and doctors, or did your drinking buddies on the weekend know that you were going through this
No,
process?
After I had that panic attack, I became a recluse. I didn't see any of my friends. I couldn't work. I literally didn't work for 18 months to 2 years. I was living off my savings.
Does that mean you literally quit your job? You told them I can't come back to work?
Yeah.
And they just said, okay?
No, they were like, why? and tried to get me to come back. But I just couldn't, is the reality. Like my mind was pretty fried at that point. So I did go to different therapists, and I probably wasn't as committed to one because intuitively I felt like this isn't right for me. Even the lady that I saw that gave me ADHD, I saw her for like 12 months. And the whole time I'm like, I don't think I have this. But then, back then, what do I know? This lady's gone to college and she's skilled and highly recommended, and I'm just going to trust her. So, that was a scenario for a long period of time. And then one day a friend had come to my house. At this point, my mother was actually looking after me. She flew back from Hong Kong to look after me because I was pretty sick. I was very skinny, wasn't eating, pretty sick. And this friend of mine's like, why don't you come and do a yoga class with me? And hand on my heart, I said, I don't own any Lululemons. I can't go. That was it. And then it was like, no, but just come. You'll get a lot out of it. There's lots of girls there. At least worst case scenario, you can look at the girls. And it's such a stupid reason, but I said yes. I'm like, okay, I'll go. I'll check it out. But he actually ended up taking me to a studio that was a Buddhist meditation studio. And this was the first time I'd really come back into contact with Buddhism for probably 10 years, maybe 15 years, maybe even a bit longer. And there was something really magical in that first moment when I saw my teacher. He walked into the room. He looked at me.
Before we get to this part, because this is a very juicy part of the story, but I have some follow-up questions
please,
about your friend and the circumstances that you were in when your friend came around. So you were taking Xanax to go to sleep, which you developed an addiction to. You were on Ritalin during the day to stay awake, which you were also addicted to. your mom came in, you were living with your brother, I believe, at a certain point. Your dad was sending you money, right? Is all this is all correct?
Yeah.
At what point, like, did you realize you were addicted, or did someone around you say, you know, Manoj, excuse me, you need to do something about this. This is not cool.
No, I knew I couldn't really function. And this is the thing with those particular drugs is not that I didn't take them because it made me feel good. I literally had to take them. I had to take Xanax to fall asleep. And when I didn't sleep, and there would be countless times where I would take a whole tablet of Xanax and not sleep. You know, it was that bad, the insomnia. For me, I never took it recreationally to have fun and go out and party. It was just like, I can't actually function without these things. So at a certain point, I stopped taking Ritalin, but I was still taking Xanax because that was the only way I was able to go to sleep, you know, and to wake up. And it wasn't until, obviously, and we'll get to that part, that I met my teacher that things started to change.
But it also disassociated you from your body, which is something we all know now from hearing this much of your story. You really don't like, that you can't tolerate it. And you started having suicidal ideations. What stopped you from taking that more seriously?
Two things. One was my daughter. Just the idea of someone having to tell her was very heartbreaking for me. The other thing was that there was someone watching over me, and you know, I didn't know again if it was Buddha or God, spirit, consciousness, but I'm like, there is a world outside of this. And I started praying, and I didn't know who I was praying to. I remember at one point I was just like, every night I would go to sleep and just ask to be better and to look up, and for, you know, life to look after my child and my family and my friends. And prayer became like a very central practice to me.
So the reason I want to go deeper into this part of your story, because I feel like a lot of people can relate to this, right? You feel burnt out, you may be reclusive, and you may be having some suicidal thoughts, you may be depressed. So looking back at that period of your life with your mom, your brother, your dad around, right? And which is the benefit of coming from this sort of family-oriented society. And your daughter, who was an accidental addition to your life, ended up inadvertently saving your life, possibly. Is there anything that you found that your associates or friends or even your family were doing that helped you in hindsight to get through this period? And is there anything that they were doing that may have been unintentionally harming you more, or saying during that time?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question when you consider what it was like 16, 17, maybe 18 years ago versus now. I think now we have a lot more understanding around mental health, and we talk about it more openly, right? It's not something that's riddled with shame. When someone says I'm anxious, it's almost your everyday vernacular now, that sort of language. But back then it was very strange. And again, for immigrant families, you just don't talk about these things. You know, it's like when I said I might be depressed, and I was like, what are you going to be depressed for? You've got everything you want.
Snap out of it. Right.
Snap out of it. And I don't shame them at all for that language, because they never were educated on how to navigate that themselves, right? But I think what I experienced with my mother and, you know, subsequently my teacher was compassion, you know, and that was really what began to transform my life. My mother, and we have, you know, a love-hate relationship at the best of times, like I'm sure a lot of people do. She just came from Hong Kong, where she was living, and just cooked for me every day. A lot of the time I wouldn't eat because I just couldn't, you know, but she would just cook for me every day. She'd make my bed every day. She'd just be there, you know, and that is just tremendously precious and sweet. And it's the love of a mother, obviously a love of a parent. But just knowing that she was there in the house felt very healing, because prior to that, while I was going through a lot of these problems, I was living by myself. My parents were living in Hong Kong at the time. So just to have them around, just to know that someone was there caring for you was really special. And then later on, my teacher, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because 18 months is significant. That's a significant amount of time. Like if you have a friend who's being reclusive for that long, there are few people who could be compassionate, in that situation like that. Because eventually you would start to think, well, just, come on, man, you got everything, you got so much but that's oftentimes the wrong thing to say if you're really trying to hold space for someone like that. So
yeah.
This friend of yours that eventually was successful in getting you out of the house, was he one of your old drinking buddies? Was he a new friend who was into like Buddhism? Like, where did he come from, and how did you know this person?
Yeah, he was actually a very, very new friend that we had just vaguely crossed paths with, and it was on Facebook. He sent me a message, and he's like, "Hey, let's go check out this studio." And he sent me a video of the studio, and the video had my teacher, who was a Sri Lankan man, and he was young. He looked honestly younger than me, and I'm like, strange, but he had this really thick Sri Lankan accent, and just the way he was speaking, there's something about it was it just spoke to me, and I felt at that moment it's like coming home. Like I heard that accent, I saw this guy, he's talking about suffering and all these different elements of life, and I'm like, this feels like it could be something really good. And the funny story is, I actually messaged him on Facebook, on email, and I'm like, "Hello, these are all my problems." And I listed them all down. I didn't even know what came over me. I'm just like, I just thought he should know. And again, up until this point, I thought it was a yoga studio. So maybe, he thought like this posture would be good for me or something. And he replied back with just saying, "I've been waiting for you. Come on Thursday." And
how long did it take him to reply back to your message?
About 2 hours.
Wow.
And I assumed my friend had mentioned something to him, but I later found out he hadn't at all. So it was just very spooky. One of the many spooky things that I experienced with him, but I definitely think it was very karmic, our connection.
And did your friend know you were going through all this emotional, psychological, spiritual problem?
I think so. I think he assumed. I wasn't very good at talking about my feelings, and maybe a lot of people listening to this can relate, especially as men. But I wasn't very good at being open with a lot of my friends. Like I didn't explain to them the depth of what I was going through. I just said, a lot of the time I was like, I'm just going through a hard time. I'm just sick. Those would be some of the things that I would say. I would never really open up about what I was going through. And that was part of the problem in retrospect, right? But that was my way of handling those things.
It's just so interesting that this person you barely knew was able to intuit that this is something that could potentially help you, and then was able to persuade you to come out of your cave and introduce you to this person. So let's cut to the studio. You meet your teacher for the first time, and you had mentioned the feeling you had earlier. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I rarely believed in things like this prior to me experiencing it, but there was something really magical about seeing this teacher for the first time, in which I looked at him and I'm like, "Oh, I've seen you before." Like just a very familiar feeling, and that didn't feel woo at the time at all. But as we're going through the class, it quickly became evident that this wasn't like a normal yoga class. This was very much like Dharma talk and meditation and some gentle movements. It was like he was seeing into my experience and telling me exactly what I needed to hear. And the first thing is that, suffering is inevitable. And I felt like I was hearing that again for the first time. Like, he's like, we're all going to suffer in this life simply by being born. And I was like, huh, interesting. Then he's like, don't identify with your suffering. And then I was like, you are not your thoughts. And when he said that, there was something, again, pretty incredible that happened. It was like it snapped me out of a dream, because at that moment, I noticed I was having all of these thoughts, and I became consciously aware of it. One thought was, you're never going to get well again. Another thought was, you're a terrible father. How are you going to make a living? What are you going to have for lunch? Like, all of these random thoughts were going on. And I realized at that very moment he said that I could observe these thoughts without actually becoming each thought. And up until that point, I was thrown around, yanked around by every thought that I had. And that was really interesting for me. And I think that was the hook that got me to come back the next day and the next day and the next day. But I remember that evening when I went home, I had one of the best sleeps I've ever had. And I'm like, whoa, this feels addictive. So I want to feel this well rested again. So I came back the next day and actually practiced with him every day for 5 years.
Okay. So you had blown through all of your savings, I'm assuming, after 18 months. How were you able to afford to, what was the cost to come back to this class? Was it a donation, or did he take pity on you?
Yeah, so I could afford to pay for about 6 months with him. Mm-hmm. And then he was just like, you pay me back when you can. And that was it. And he didn't take money from me for about 4 years. And every now and again, I started to work after the first 2-3 years. But when I started to work, I paid him back the money. But yeah, he really supported me in many ways. At one point, I lived with him as well, because I got really sick before I got really better. And he let me stay with him for about 6 months. And I helped him on the land. Like, he had his beautiful sprawling house. I gardened every day. I cleaned the meditation studio, which was in his house. It was a small, studio, and I mopped the mats and cleaned the cushions and helped him with his marketing. It felt like an actual ashram in India at one point.
Was he more of a sort of a boutique type of teacher that you had to know someone to get in his circle, yeah, or was he like a big name in Melbourne that everybody knew?
No one knows about him, not even now. But he, in that time I was with him, I genuinely saw maybe about 6 people not commit suicide because of being in not just his presence, but being in that community. Mm-hmm. I saw people whose marriages were broken heal. I saw one lady who was given 6 months to live from cancer have spent 9 years, in that community, and became such a pillar of that community. There was just something about this practice and the emphasis on compassion and community that really transformed so many lives. And it was definitely a large part of it was because of him as well. He wasn't a big name teacher. His name is Channa Dasanayaka, for anyone that's listening to this that wants to find out.
Say it a little slower.
First name is Channa, and his surname is Dasanayaka. Okay. And his teachings have evolved, and I'd be happy to share about that now. But he, I think, became so many people's parents, in a very weird turn of events. And what I learned from him was compassion. That was the first thing that I learned from him. I learned how to be with my pain and my suffering. It's been my hardest lesson, what I'm still working on. And he taught me generosity. And when I was in service, when I was helping him, when I was giving without expecting anything in return, my life was so full. I still remember he took me to Bali for a retreat, and I would be the helper. I literally would do everything on that retreat. And All I had to do was pay for my flight. People from all around the world would come and study with him. And every day I would work for like 12 hours, on top of doing this retreat, which is tremendously hard. It was a mix between Vipassana and gentle movements and things like that. It was so mentally difficult. I would then have to mop the whole studio after every sitting. So there was 3 sittings a day. I would sweep it. I would go and get him his tea. I would make sure the flowers were arranged. And it was so mentally hard. The first 4 days on that very first retreat, I was like, I've had it. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I'm tired. Like, why do these women who are also in his group get to just hang out with you and have tea? And here I am cleaning and like mopping and like dusting. And it became what I needed to learn. It was like it became my way of understanding my ego and how tightly it holds on to entitlement, and how tightly I don't want to work hard for what is really true for me. And those lessons, even as I'm speaking to you now, and I haven't spoken about this for a long time, so thank you for asking. As I reflect on these teachings, I'm getting chills, because I was so happy. I was so happy because it wasn't about me. It wasn't about me at all. Like, I was just doing this for the benefit of everyone else. And in turn, by the end of that retreat, I just felt full. And it kind of snuck up on me. It's like, oh, look at all these people, smiling at me. And I felt their love and admiration because they saw me working hard every day. But I also saw them go through their own evolution on retreats. And it just gave me a lot of joy. So thanks for that.
I was just writing about this earlier today about, it's a cliche, but it's so true. When the student is ready, the teacher appears, right? And the so-called work is about making yourself a worthy student. Because some people may hear that description of you, mopping floors and think, oh, he's just treating you like a slave. But really, it's about dedicating yourself to a level of service that opens you up to be able to receive that compassion, to be able to receive that knowledge. And there's a really beautiful alchemy that occurs organically that you don't even realize is occurring until it already fills you up. And you're just like, wow, I'm just so connected to everything, because I've essentially had to transcend the thing that was keeping me disconnected and disembodied, which is my ego. And so it's a beautiful description.
I really love that reflection. And I think, in the West, we're so used to instant gratification, right? When we go to a teacher, we're like, hey, Manoj, teach me something. I want to learn this. I want to learn how to stress less. Teach it to me. And, a lot of us, we have these things that we can give to people. But some of our teachers, I know you and I had very old school traditional teachers. They wouldn't do it like that. They wouldn't just give it to you like that. I had to study for 10 years before my teacher would even consider me a teacher. But the way he taught me was through experience. I had to listen.
Yeah, the quickest way to turn a true teacher off is to tell them how to teach you.
Right. Give me this and give it to me now. And, our culture loves that. But there's something really profound and sacred in observing my teacher. I learned 90% just by observing him. 10% was what he actually sat down and taught me. He rarely did that, actually. These nights on retreat at about 11 o'clock, once everything was cleaned up, would go to his room and he would just talk. And I would sit there for hours just listening to what he said.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience with my teacher. I would help set up and break down rooms and, kind of be the servant, play the servant role. And I just loved it. I couldn't get enough of it because it allowed me to be close in proximity to the knowledge. And I remember some of the axioms that he would say, such as nature's rejection is nature's protection. And you don't expect a mango to fall from an apple tree. And, things like that I still draw from today, and it helps to give me perspective. What were some of the axioms or sayings that your teacher would echo in addition to you're not your thoughts? Was there anything else that kind of stands out today that you still think about?
Yeah, I mean, his favorite was witness. He would just say that, witness. I'm like, what? Like, I'm like, oh, I'd go to him on retreats, especially. I'm like, teacher, I'm feeling like, I called him Guruji. Guruji, I was feeling, last night I was thinking about my ex-girlfriend. And, like, I'd usually be on retreats with heartbreak, actually, which was funny.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have these really dark thoughts, and I'd be there just sad and broken. And he'd look me in my eyes, and he would just say, just witness. And I hated that because I wanted a more profound answer. Only now do I understand how profound that really is, right? And what he was really teaching me was to just observe this experience and not get caught up in it. But, I wanted a more clear answer. I wanted something to do. And he was inviting me to work. Like, just witness means work. I don't want to work. Just tell me how to get rid of these thoughts.
How long would you say it took you to kind of come back to yourself from that very broken aspect of yourself when you first met him that first day to you walking out of there feeling like, I'm me again?
Yeah, I think 6 months. Six months. 6 months was when I was off all medication.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wouldn't say I came back to me until probably like a year after that. But the me I came back to was a me I never knew. It wasn't like the old me. It was a very different me. It was a me that, when I eventually went back to work in the corporate world, I did that for 6 months and I hated it. And I was killing my job. Like, I was so good at it. I was making more money than I'd ever had. I was having a lot more fun in one way because I was more creative. But it just felt very empty, very soulless. Like, I was, marketing, I think, electricity at that point. And I'm like, what? Like, here I am spending my nights with my teacher, and people are, transforming their lives, and, and here I am just marketing energy. Like, dude. So it became very clear at that point, like, I have to take control of my life at some point. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. Still, I didn't even think about becoming a teacher. It wasn't in my life goals or my path. I just knew I didn't want to do this. And I remember asking my teacher within the first 3 times I saw him, and I'm like, what am I don't know what I'm meant to do with my life. I feel very lost. And he said, I think you're going to teach people. And I'm like, no way. Like, it just seemed like the most unglamorous job at that point, because my teacher didn't make much money. He wasn't interested in clothes, and he wasn't interested in, fun things and experiences like, I was at that age. And I just
was he a robe wearing teacher, or did he dress kind of normally?
He did both. He wore robes, like on retreats and sometimes at class, but mainly he just wore really simple clothes.
So if you saw him out on the street, you wouldn't know that he was you wouldn't know if you didn't have the awareness to kind of read his karma. You wouldn't know that he was a teacher.
Probably not. No, probably not. He looks younger than me now, and he's probably in his 50s now. Yeah, so I didn't want to do teaching. I never thought of it, and then it actually came around because I started dating a yoga teacher at one point, and I wanted to impress her, who you actually met when we were in Venice, that one time. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'll impress her if I do a yoga teacher training with her. And I didn't like teaching yoga. I actually hated it. But I said, I'll spend more time with her. And I came out of that and I realized I was actually really good at teaching yoga. But I just didn't like the practice because it was so, just physical. And I remember telling my teacher, hey, I've been asked by this studio to teach yoga. And he's like, oh, good. Because he wouldn't let me. He said, you have to practice with me for 10 years until I can even consider you ready of being a teacher. And at that point, it was 7 years, I think it was, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I guess I'll teach yoga then. And I taught yoga for a while. But one day, as I was spending my time with my teacher, I came to do his class like I would every day. And he said, "Hey, I'm not feeling well. Can you teach tonight?" And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, no, like I haven't prepared, because, I used to go to yoga class with these books full of sequences and quotes.
What
like
would that mean though for you to teach? Give a Dharma talk for 15 minutes and then guide a meditation, or what would that look like?
Exactly that. Yeah. In the Buddhist context, it was give a talk for a period of time and then lead a practice. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, I was like that. And he said to me, "I'll only ever ask you once for this opportunity. It's either yes or no." And he said it like that. And I'm like,
wow, that's very strong.
Like, it's very strong. And I'm like, and I also didn't want to let my teacher down, and I knew he was sick. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it. And it was in his house, don't forget, right? So I go in there and I'm like nervous, and I started writing some stuff down, and he takes the book away from me. He's like, "Don't ever prepare for a meditation class, ever."
Wow.
And I'm like, so I go in and I tried to emulate him, because what he would do is for the first minute, he would just close his eyes. He would like meditate or just, connect with guides or whatever it was. And then he would teach his class, usually with his eyes closed. So I go in there trying to emulate my teacher, eyes closed, trying to
nothing's coming.
Right. Nothing's coming. And I open my eyes and I see my teacher sitting next to me. He's in class doing the class. And I'm like, oh, shit.
As if you weren't already nervous enough.
It just really and then I just went into my practice. And then I just remembered all the times I used to practice with him. And I would practice often with my eyes closed, just feeling into the moment. And I just let go of the mind, and I just let whatever came out. And it was a great class. It was a great first class in practice. And I think I spoke about just coming home to the body. I think that was probably my first class, and what I spoke about, and observing nature, I think was another thing I brought up. And obviously I went to my teacher straight after the class. I'm like, "How was it? Was it good?" And he was like, "Okay." He was like that. But then he asked me to teach 2 more times, and he used the same excuse. "I'm sick. I can't do it. I'm tired today." And he sat in on those classes. And then at one point he's like, "I think you're ready to teach." And I'm like, wow. And what that meant for me was I was ready to give myself to this career. But what I didn't do is think it through, because I was like, okay, I'm going to be a teacher now. So I quit my job, and it was a 6-figure salary, it was really great. And I just, without any plan, just said, I'm going to teach. So I would teach like 3 to 4 yoga classes, and then I would go to my meditation studio with my teacher, which was so tiny. I would teach 3 or 4 classes there. And I made $30,000 that first year, and I think for the first 2 years, it was around that.
What's interesting is you said earlier, you wanted to take control of your life, right? But from the outside looking in, you were already making 6 figures. So in the sort of conventional mindset of what success is supposed to look like, you were in control of your life. You had means, you had resources, you had a network. But what you were talking about was connecting with your internal self, your spirit, right? And so even though you only made $30,000 in this first year, you were now sort of living your dharmic path, which is a different quality of experience than going to a 6-figure job that you don't feel connected to.
I agree. And I think, I have done a lot of research for my book on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I've been reflecting on that a lot. And this sense of purpose and community, I think it's just almost as important as food. Honestly, I think it's just so critical.
Spiritual nourishment. Yeah.
Spiritual nourishment, because that was what I didn't have. I had friends. Sure, I would go and do stuff with them, but I didn't have like a community, a group of people looking towards the same direction, working towards it, helping each other get there. and I didn't have a sense of purpose. Like I was just coming to work every day and doing this thing. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that for anyone listening. Like your purpose can be your children, and your work can be a means of supporting them. Your purpose can be what's outside of work, and the money you make at your 9 to 5 can support that. But for me, I felt very confused and lost in that experience, because even though I was okay at doing what I was doing, I just never felt connected to it. I'm like, this cannot be like what I do for the rest of my life. And so, yeah, those first few years where I was making very little money, and keep in mind, Buddhist meditation teachers usually operate under dana. So dana means generosity, which means usually people would give donations. So you wouldn't really even get paid for classes. A lot of my money came from the yoga classes that I was teaching, and then the random workshops I did here and there. So it was an interesting time, and it was also probably the happiest time of my life. If I look back, I was very fulfilled.
So your teacher, did he teach from more of a eclectic tradition, Buddhist tradition? Is something that he kind of put together, or was there sort of a more strict, rigid, like ceremonial, you have to do this, you have to do that in order to teach properly? Because later on you open up a space, which is a secular, non-denominational meditation space. And sometimes that could be a little bit of a conflict for people who come from a very traditional path.
Yeah. He was a Theravada Buddhist monk. That was his, formal sort of background. But, and I learned a lot of Theravada Buddhism from him, in particular, a central text to that, which is known as the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But over the years, he started to really broaden his lens, which is something I really admired about him, because he was very receptive, to other traditions and other ways of practicing. And he would always see the interconnection between, Islam, for example, and Buddhism, and some of the things that they intersected on. And secular mindfulness was something that he brought in a lot into our classes. Because keep in mind, like, he didn't have all Buddhists in his class. He had a lot of different, people from different walks and backgrounds. And so when I opened A Space, like, the first person I asked for his blessing was him. And he came and he did a Buddhist ceremony to help me open the space. He was very supportive of everything that I did.
Okay, so let's talk about that. You're making $30,000 a year. How do you afford to open up your own meditation studio? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it took to me and my co-founder at the stage, we both took out 2 credit cards. Wouldn't recommend that. We both asked our parents, for money, and they generously gave us money. And we opened it up with the most shoestring of budgets. And it really started because we were doing pop-up events. We would borrow someone's cafe and run this event around, and we talk about fear, and we talk about how meditation and Buddhist practice can help us navigate this, or we'll talk about heartbreak. And it started to have a bit of a cult following in Melbourne. People were like, who are these cool young dudes, like, dressed like this, talking about subjects like this? And we would get 50 to 100 people at some of these events.
Is this someone you met through your teacher's community, or is this someone else you connected with in your yoga teacher training?
No, just someone that came to a yoga class one day, and a mutual friend introduced us. It's like, hey, you guys should talk to each other, because at that point I had started thinking about, okay, if I'm going to ever have a family, I need to think about, how I can afford to do that. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll do something on my own. And then his name is Josh, was introduced to me, and he had also been really curious and interested in meditation and spirituality. So we connected on that level, and it was a fast and beautiful friendship, and as these pop-up events started to get more notorious, we started seeing people come back just to hang out with the people that they had met last time. They're like, I can't go anywhere and talk about this sort of stuff with anyone else. And, my friends don't really want to talk about meditation. They just want to go and get drunk. but I met, these really cool, girls, and I want to hang out with them. So we started to see a little bit of a community form. And Josh initially didn't want to open a studio. He's the smart one out of both of us. He was like, I don't think it makes financial sense, and we're going into debt, and we don't really have much money coming in. But I was like, look, dude, there's like no one in Australia is doing this. No one, and this is growing. And I knew that the trajectory of meditation globally was heading in a direction where it was going to get widespread support. So I, convinced him to open this studio, and he, for all his wisdom, was really excited by the end of it. And we opened it in the back of this small psychology studio, and we had maybe 1,000, not even, maybe like 600 square feet was how big this studio was. And we got all our friends to pitch in. Someone gave us, they interior decorated the place. If we did a workshop at their work, another friend donated flowers. The biggest investment were these chairs that were meditation chairs that cost like $500 each. But I knew they looked cool and people would talk about them a lot. So that became our biggest investment. And then we found some really amazing teachers. And then we kicked it off in 2015. And what a journey.
So talk about some of the lessons you learned from running a meditation studio.
Check your ego was one. Mm-hmm. I learned very quickly that my ego loved a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. If you're a meditation teacher, as best as you can, try to hire someone to be the CEO. Don't try to do both. I was doing both at one time, and I fried myself, and I experienced burnout. Was working. I would switch between teaching a meditation class, then going and interviewing people, then worrying about this and worrying about that, and going back to a meditation class. I think also be really clear on your why, which is not just a business philosophy, but probably a life philosophy. If you have a very strong and clear reasoning as to why you're doing what you're doing, you can ride out the difficult times. There'll always be something there to help you on that journey. And then don't be greedy is the last thing. We never took investment because we wanted to own the whole company, and that caused us to burn out. And eventually we went separate ways, Josh and I. And it was all very amicable and great, but part of that was because we weren't making any money, for a long period of time. All the money we were making was just going back into the business, and it took its toll on us for sure.
How are you making your ends meet if you guys weren't making, or you mean after the meager salaries that you were taking?
Yeah, we were taking very little from the business. I was doing lots of privates. I was doing corporate events. I was still teaching yoga on the side. I would consult marketing on projects. I would just find money wherever I could. To be honest, there was no rhyme or reason. I was just doing a lot, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so eventually Open expressed interest in acquiring you. Was that before the pandemic?
Yeah. So once Josh had left, I took on a space by myself individually, and had.
Did you have to pay Josh out when he left?
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. There was that involved. It's funny. I had a vision for Open that revolved around it becoming an educational platform, not a meditation platform, because there was a lot of that already. I had this idea that people wanted to learn and grow, and they wanted to know how to navigate their life. That was really why a lot of people were coming to us. They're like, how can meditation help me get through this relationship? How can meditation help me navigate grief? How can meditation help me do this, do that? And there is such a vast amount of Buddhist wisdom that a lot of people can't access because for whatever reason, it doesn't speak to them, or whoever is delivering it connect with them, you know? And so I had this idea of turning A Space into an educational platform. And I had some pretty good traction, you know, with our business. The framework was there. People saw that there was plenty of assets left in the business. And I moved to New York for like, I think 5 months in 2017. And I started having this dream of moving to New York and launching this platform, because New York really, you know, healed me at the end of a relationship. And in 2019, I started fundraising for A Space. I found partners that were helping me in that process, and I found investors, and we were about to do it. In February 9th, 2020, I told my girlfriend, I'm like, okay, I'll be back. I'm going to go close everything down, and I'll be back in 2 weeks, you know. And I went back to Australia, started packing it up, and then the pandemic happened, and everything fell apart. My investors pulled out. My partners weren't ready to go into it at that time, because New York was hit the hardest initially. And my world fell apart, actually, when it came to work. And it was very stressful. And 3 months, there was that uncertainty. And then a mutual friend introduced me to the CEO of Open, which was at that stage a small breathwork studio in San Francisco. And he just said, hey, help them out with, you know, some ideas, and, you know, just consult. And me and Ride, the CEO, were chatting for a little bit, and I was helping them out for a period of time. And then we both kind of realized we loved working with each other, and we were both trying to do the same thing. And for them, breath work was an entry point into mindfulness. And for me, mindfulness was the doorway to self-actualization and self-realization. And so we kind of amalgamated the two. I joined as a co-founder of Open. We decided to launch an app. I decided to move to LA, and here I am.
And your app is something that people can experience live, meditation classes. What else about it makes it unique?
You can experience it live and on demand. And we genuinely believe, like, this ability to be mindful, to experience genuine presence, connection, and compassion can happen through many ways. It can happen through the body, it can happen through the mind, but it can fundamentally happen through the breath. So we have these different modalities like breath work, like meditation, and we've built a pretty unique proprietary technology that enables people to feel really connected to their friends who are practicing with them live, as well as on demand.
You also just published a new book, Still Together, which came out ironically the same day as my book, Knowing Where to Look, came out.
That must be good juju.
How did that happen? Like, because, you know, sometimes people, you have this idea and you look for someone to publish it, or sometimes they reach out to you and they say, hey, we love what you're doing. Would you like to write something? Like, how to talk about that process?
The irony was that I got a book deal in 2019. It was a student that used to come to A Space a lot, and she loved practicing with me. And her family, incidentally, has one of the biggest publishing houses in Australia and the UK. And they're like, hey, we think you'd be great to write a book. Would you be open? And I was like, okay, I could write a book. That's cool. And then I started thinking about what. And the one thing I had struggled with my whole life was to feel connected, you know, as an immigrant child, feeling connection to others, feeling connection to myself, feeling connection to this present moment. And so I had this idea of writing a book about connection. And that was what I got the deal on. I brought a proposal. I'm like, it's about connection, exploring the ways we're disconnected in our life, and then talking about the ways we can reconnect. And the irony was that I put off writing this book in 2019 up until I had like 9 months left of my 18-month, you know, to write the book. And the 9 months left was in 2020, when I was in Australia, when we were in the middle of a pandemic, when I was in lockdown and I could only leave the house for 1 hour a day, I had to write a book about connection. And I'm like, what are the chances? I'm the most disconnected I've ever been. And here I am having to write a book about it. So everything I wrote was a byproduct of what I had to practice and go through. And it's rooted in Buddhist wisdom. It's rooted in some research that I did and some scientific underpinnings of human connection. And it explores we can find a way to reconnect back with our lives and with the world around us.
I love that. And how are you defining success these days? Like literally today, like what does success look like for you?
Yeah, I mentioned this in the book. It's how connected I am to my life. How connected I am to my body in each moment. How connected I am to you, Light, in this conversation. How connected I am to love and spaciousness and we call it this quality of emptiness in Buddhism. How connected I am to my spirituality. That really for me is success, because I've gone through the roller coaster of financial success, and I know that there's a certain amount of money that one needs to feel safe, and that number is different for everyone else. But beyond that, you can have a lot of money and still be very unhappy. And I've done that too. And so now for me, it's how deeply connected I am to the things that matter the most to me in my life.
And I feel like in this context, unhappiness is feeling disconnected. Doesn't matter how much money you have, what your position is, how much people love you. If you feel disconnected, then that's the opposite of being successful. And it seemed like you had to go through this really dark tunnel experience, which we call normal life, of trying to be successful from the outside in. And you lost that connection. And through finding your teacher, your path, you were able to reconnect to what was truly important. And what's also interesting in hearing your story is almost everything that has led you to the next step, the next breadcrumb along your journey, happened as a result of somebody else stepping in. So your mother helping to care for you, your daughter keeping you from potentially committing suicide, someone introducing you to your teacher, someone connecting you with Josh, someone connecting you with the co-founder of the Open Center, student connecting you with the publishing deal. Like somebody, it's like your whole journey has been about connection. And I just think that's a really beautiful testimony to, you don't have to necessarily try to make things happen. You just follow your inner guidance wherever it leads you. And the people who resonate with that will eventually step in and connect you to whatever that next phase of your life is supposed to be.
I didn't actually look at it like that until you said that. So thank you. And yes, and I think what the through line and the thread is from all those interactions was there was always a moment of surrender right before it happened. I had been pushing uphill, like even before A-Space was acquired, I had been like stressing, pushing. And then I'm just like, you know what, like maybe this is the end of the road for A-Space. Maybe, I'll just sell it and that's it. And at that moment, someone was interested, and that was it. And I remember, even with my teacher, there was a moment where I was running out of money. My parents couldn't give me any more. And I had been kind of living off them and living off my savings. And I had maybe $300 left in my bank account. And I was just like, this is going to last me a week. What am I going to do? And I'm just like, my teacher just said, just something will happen. Just let it be. And literally at the end of that week, I got a job offer to come back and work. And I think as I think about this now, and you're reflecting this so beautifully back to me, as I go through challenges now in my day, in my life, I'm coming back to that. It's like, where can you just let go? At this moment, where is it that you let go? Even if it's a thought, even if it's just an idea, or even if it's just a physical releasing of your shoulders, where can you let go?
Well, thank you for sharing your story so generously. I think it's going to help a lot of people because I'm pretty sure anyone listening to this can relate to some aspect of your journey. And I highly recommend, picking up the book. It's full of really gentle wisdom. We talked about the difference in Still Together and other sort of meditation books, which typically talk about stress and all the, medical benefits you get from meditating, which is, I think, becoming more and more well known. And you wanted to talk more about which aspects of the practice.
Well, I think for me, there's enough research on meditation. Like, you don't need me to. I'm not a doctor, so I don't want to claim to be someone that can talk to you about the benefits. I think at this point, if you're listening to this podcast with a teacher such as yourself, there's benefit in meditation, right? What I am trying to reorientate people towards is perhaps like the purpose of the practice. And the tip of the iceberg for me is stress relief and better sleep, right? But to me, I equate that to eating an avocado and eating it with the skin on and saying that tastes great. What I'm trying to invite people to do is to peel the avocado, cut it open, and eat the inside. And the inside is the richness and the depth that exists once we go beyond just our limited view of this experience and this practice. And the tip of the iceberg as well is connection. But beyond that, there's an actual path to self-liberation. There is a path to freedom. There is a path to love. There is a path to compassion and to healing and to forgiveness. And it lays beyond our limited view of what we think this practice can really give us. And I'm saying all of that not to denigrate stress relief, because we need that first, right? Again, that's where we begin. But there's also this invitation, this gentle invitation to go beyond that and to see what else is there for you.
Beautiful. And if someone wants to experience you as a meditation teacher, is that available on the platform?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can practice with me live on Open on demand. You can jump into our app and experience us for 14 days. It's completely free. Just find me. I'm around.
Well, we'll link to all of your social media and website and stuff like that. Thank you so much, man, for coming onto the show and for sharing.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.